Welcome to Learning with Bens. Today, we will be looking on types of research method in preparation for CAPE Sociology Unit 1 exam. This is a three-part video, so let's get started with our first presentation on types of research methods. What are our objectives for today? By the end of this lesson, you should be able to differentiate between positivist and interpretivist methodology and identify the links with quantitative and qualitative data. 2, outline and assess primary and secondary sources of data collection. And 3, identify the different types of sampling techniques used in research. Let's get started. Here is a simple diagram of the research process. It has 8 steps. First, you identify the problem. You find the literature for your literature review. You do your research questions, your aims and your objectives. Then you move on to choosing the study design, which is also known as your research design. Then you do your sample design, moving on to collecting data. Then you process and analyze your data. You write the reports, and that will be your final step in a simple research process. This diagram depicts the scientific research process. You have a theory, and you use a theory to form your hypothesis. After you have your hypothesis, you now design the study to test the hypothesis. Moving on to what is now known as your research. You then need to perform your research, and this can be done through observation. Next, you will create or modify your theory. And this is a simple scientific research process. Now, what is a theory? According to Curlington 1986, a theory is a statement that explains and predicts a phenomenon. Now, the scientific principles of research, and I'm going to look on hypothesis because we have mentioned that previously. A hypothesis is a proposition made as a basis for reasoning without any assumption of its truth. In other words, it is an assumption or hunch about a phenomenon that needs further investigation. The hypothesis students that every event has a cause. There are other definitions for hypothesis, but the main thing about the hypothesis is that it is a proposed explanation for a phenomenon. Now, for a hypothesis to be scientific, or rather for a hypothesis to be a scientific hypothesis, the scientific method requires that one can test it. Now, scientists generally base scientific hypotheses on previous observations that cannot satisfactorily be explained with the available scientific theories. Now, in sociology, a hypothesis should explain what you expect to happen. It should be clear and understandable. It should be testable. It should be measurable, and it should contain a dependent and independent variable. The variables are the elements. Now, what are these variables? Independent and dependent variables. Now, an independent variable is one that is controlled or manipulated during an experiment to observe how it affects others. To break this down, an independent variable is a variable that you think is the cause, whereas a dependable variable is one that changes as a result of changes in other things. What is it that I am saying here? Simply put, a dependent variable is a variable with the effect. Now let's look at an example of a hypothesis in research. So the hypothesis states, this study is designed to assess the hypothesis that sleep-deprived people will perform worse on a test than individuals who are not sleep-deprived. That is an example of an hypothesis. We're going to move on to what is known as positivism and interpretivism research method. What is positivism? In positivist research method is scientific. Positivism employs methods that are very scientific and produces quantitative findings. This was postulated by Stevenson in 1998. Now, the scientific method adopted by positivists is known as hypothetical deductive method. This method comprises of several stages, and we have looked on it in previous slides. One, you form your hypothesis. You test your hypothesis, number two. Number three, you obtain evidence by collecting data. Number four, you analyze that data. And then finally, and number five, you either confirm or reject the hypothesis. Now, this is an exercise for you to do. You're going to examine the hypothesis below and identify the independent and dependent variable. So remember what the hypothesis was. This study is designed to assess the hypothesis that sleep-deprived people will perform worse on a test than individuals who are not sleep-deprived. Now go ahead. Identify the independent and the dependent variable. Now, if you mention sleep-deprived people are the independent variable, then you are correct. If you mention that perform worse on a test than individuals who are not sleep-deprived as a dependable variable, as a dependent variable, then you are correct. So remember, the independent variable is the cause and the dependent variable is the effect. Here is another example for you to identify the independent and the dependent variable in the hypothesis above. So the hypothesis is the use of audiovisual material boosts students' achievement. Now go ahead. Identify the independent variable and the dependent variable. Once you finish doing that exercise, we will now move on to correlation and causation. Now, the scientist looks for relationship between two or more variables and analyze the strength of those relationships. Now, positivist sociologists also seek to discover relationships in his or her studies. Now, the example that we use of audiovisual and students' achievement shows a link that can be established as other contributory factors, such as teaching technique, can contribute to students' achievement. Now, here are some concepts as it relates to correlation and causation. What is a correlation? A correlation is a relationship or association of one variable with another. What is a control group? Now, a control group is one that receives no special stimuli and is treated normally. Experimental group. Now, the experimental group is a group in which experimental procedures are performed. A variable. Now, we have mentioned variable previously, but a variable is a characteristic that can be measured and is subject to change. There is also multivariate analysis, and this is used to minimize the possibility of making spurious correlations when there are several variables that affect a phenomenon. The researcher can therefore determine which one has the strongest effect. Finally, causation. Now, a causation is the explanation of factors that may have contributed to a result. Now, let's apply these concepts that you have learned so far. Going back to the problem, the use of audiovisual material boosts students' achievement in school. Now, the researcher could use two groups of students with similar characteristics, such as age, form, ability, and class size being taught by the same teacher at similar times during the day. One group could be considered the experimental group, who would be taught using audio-visual aids, while the other would be the control group, and they would be taught using the expository method. That is, the teacher presents the information verbally. Now, both groups would be tested before and after the allotted period of time, and the test scores would be compared. Now, the researcher would then be able to accept or reject the earlier proposition. This comparative method is preferred by sociologists. Now we are going to move on to our second objective for this class. And we're going to be looking on interpretivism as the second research method. Now, the interpretivist approach involves a systematic analysis of socially meaningful actions through the direct, detailed observation of people in natural settings in order to arrive at understanding and interpretation of how people create and maintain their social worlds. So remember, we looked at positivism. So whereas positivism or positivist focuses on measurable phenomena and objectivity, interpretivism, on the other hand, emphasizes the importance of meanings in social action. Now, Max Weber and George Herbert Mead underscore this approach. So for interpretivists, social actions cannot be understood using natural scientific methods. So remember, positivism or positivists, they use scientific methods to analyze and explain phenomena in society. So they focus on measuring phenomena and objectivity, whereas interpretivism focus on meanings in social actions, right? So interpretivism, they don't believe that human behavior can be quantified. This table will show a summary between positivism and interpretivism. So we're going to be looking on and examining this table that deals with positivism and interpretivism. Now, positivism, what is this really about? Let's look at some facts as it relates to positivism. Now, positivism look on social facts, right? Whereas interpretivism tries to understand action and meaning and motives. Positivism also depend on reliability. So they use reliability, whereas interpretivism use or focuses on validity. Positivism focus on observation, whereas interpretivism need to understand how human interests and human interest and meaning. In positivism, that theory is macro, whereas interpretivism is micro. In positivism, research is conducted from the outside. Therefore, it is quantifiable and numerical. And that is why positivism prefer to use quantitative research method. In interpretivism, as I mentioned earlier, it is micro. Therefore, personal involvement of the researcher and interpretivism look for rich, in-depth data. Therefore, they prefer to use a qualitative research method. Now we talk about reliability and validity. What is reliability? Now the research is reliable if it produces consistent results when the same methods are used repeatedly. Whereas in validity, this refers mainly to accuracy of the description or measurement. Now here we are looking on the types of sociological research. There are three main types of sociological research: quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods. And we're going to be looking on each of these individually. Quantitative research methods. Now, quantitative research methods are methods that result mainly in quantitative data. By now, you know that they are preferred by positivists. Data can be demonstrated in numerical percentages or tables. Quantitative research methods usually use primary and secondary sources of data, such as questionnaires, interviews, official statistics, and they analyze the data in a systematic way. Quantitative data is linear, meaning it follows a step-by-step procedure, hence systematic. Finally, quantitative research method, as mentioned previously, is preferred by positivists as it can be tested, it can be measured, data can be analyzed, and your conclusion can be made. Qualitative research method. Now, qualitative research methods are those methods that are preferred by interpretivists. Qualitative provide rich, thick, descriptive data. They are more in-depth and detailed, and that is why it is preferred by interpretivists because one, it taps into feelings and meanings. The data is more realistic and valid, and the method is more personal. The final type is mixed method. Now, mixed method is a research approach whereby researchers collect and analyze data using both quantitative and qualitative data within the same study. Hence the term mixed method. I hope you have understood those points that I've raised so far in this presentation. Now we are going to be looking on some exam practice questions. And the first one, assess the strengths and limitation of the different kinds of qualitative techniques used in sociology. There are also other questions, exam practice questions in this presentation that you can use the information that have been presented as well as those that will be presented in your next session. We have come to the end of this presentation. Next time, we'll be looking on method of data collection. Please stay tuned for the next presentation.